I'm just going to record from the start here. Great to see the enthusiasm. I appreciate that, Lawrence, about the distinction between causes and reasons you've been thinking about all week since the last one. Let me begin here with, I plan to come back to the comments today. Hopefully that'll work out well. Let me start with an overview about, I'll put this slide up. I have a few new slides, but also this was from last time. Let me give an overview of what's actually the case. So we need to, let me see here though. I feel like there's two basic mistakes. I'll come back to this, but these are, and I know a lot of people are watching this also when they watch for the second time and so forth, to be able to explain this to other people, you know, as well. I know people are looking forward to, because some people have heard me go through this before a year or two ago. Although this is kind of updated with additional kind of background and explanation. All right, so these are like universal mistakes, right? No matter kind of who you deal with, whether they're a philosopher or whatever, you're basically going to run into these things where people feel like their internal part of their consciousness screen basically is coming from them, right? Like your memories, your thoughts, feelings. You'll say like, well, I think this, I think that, I feel this, right? Right. It's not that I want you to change your wording or not, but I'm just pointing out that people feel like they're now they might assign guilt, to someone else or blame, I'm angry because of such and such, but like you're basically that your thoughts are coming from you, at least much of the time. Kind of obviously they're an identification with the mind and such. And then, but for your thoughts to really have come from you, then you would have had to have your thoughts prior to having your thoughts, right? If you think about that. And then another huge one is that we're perceiving the external world. And I could add to that, and we're perceiving an external world that can cause things, right? It's going to turn out that the external world can't cause things any more than like Superman can cause things, right? We can talk about Superman intelligibly. Superman can be in movies, and if there was like a powerless duck or even powerless person in a movie and he was supposed to be Superman, people would say, wait, that's not Superman, right? So we could talk intelligibly about Superman. It has Superman, the fact that Superman is Superman in a movie or story or whatever can be a reason why in the story things are able to happen, right? But Superman can't cause things in what we would call like in real life. And actually Superman doesn't cause things in a movie either, except for within the story. But the reason why anything happens would be, we can say, because of the producers, right? The actors, the writers, that sort of thing. All right. I'm not making arguments here. I'm just continuing to point things out. Remember that this whole explanation of how to know that God exists and the basic nature of God is not about providing evidence. That's actually weak. What I'm doing is stronger and more absolute, or fully absolute. You need to have the basis for understanding how to think about certain things, right? Like cause, goodness, things that are on this slide. And when you have that, then you're able to pretty quickly, especially with me leading you through it, understand that God has to exist, the basic nature of God, and a number of other things that are related. And it's interesting, I started out focused on this question of, I had this thought when I was 16 that if God exists, and if it's of central importance for us to choose to have a relationship with God, and both of those seemed reasonable, not necessarily true or not, but at least reasonable, then it made sense that maybe there was a way to actually know that, rather than life being based on having to just make a guess. And we could call that guess faith, but it's still, if we're honest, or consistent. It's just a guess, right? If we cannot know that God exists, if we have to, according to how people misuse the idea of faith, if we have to have faith, but again, there's no difference between that and just guessing, right? If we can't know, we can't know. And so I thought maybe there was a way to know. It isn't that I thought there should or shouldn't be a way to know. It isn't that I thought God owed it to me. I just figured that there may well be a way to know. And if so, God would then very much want us to figure that out, right? And then, maybe share with other people too, if they hadn't figured it out. if the other central issue was choosing God, choosing to have a relationship with God rather than to reject or ignore God. Right, faith, as I mentioned last time, can be understood instead to be consistency with what you can know. And I think that meaning makes sense out of Jesus was talking about faith over and over again. No, of course, I'm not taking it as true that Jesus was God as a basis. Obviously, I can't bring that in as an ingredient, right? In what I'm saying, obviously, we're trying to prove that God exists or show how to know that God exists without starting with a starting point. So I'm not in any way using the Bible or Jesus as some kind of starting point. However, I found Jesus to be pretty exceptional, and in certainly he talked about faith a lot, right? So it made me interested, and I felt like there might be some kind of key there in figuring out what faith could mean that would be consistent and wouldn't be like kind of a nonsense term, like knowing something you don't know, but all of a sudden you magically know it by saying I have faith that it's true. That's a nonsense. Meaning an atheist or people that are questioning are often well aware that that's nonsense, right? So it's very ineffective for sharing, what people call sharing faith, right? But sharing, bringing other people to know about God and so forth. So we would want something better. All right. Let me give an overview of how existence actually works. And remember, none of this is like a proof like someone might expect, evidence or things like that. It's all about you understanding. And I had another little quick slide here. It might be useful to be aware because we're learning stuff here potentially, or the people you're talking to will have to be learning stuff, right? And it's a different type of learning in this case because we're having to build, well, this happens a lot with learning, you have to build mental objects, right? What makes this different in some sense is that we have to also tear down existing mental objects that can get in the way. And by mental objects, I mean concepts, thoughts, actual, like anything to do with what you're kind of thinking about, whether we think of it as an abstract concept like liberty or somewhat abstract like God or goodness or a tree or a particular tree or your dog or yourself. All of these, to think about them, your mental objects is what you're thinking about, right? So we're going to want to understand the nature of that more and more. But anyway, if you, even with just kind of a starting sense of that, if we think of learning as mental objects and associations between them, but mental objects need to be created. Sometimes when we're learning, very few new mental objects need to be created. It's like kind of just a lot more, straightforward, what we call concrete and so forth. Then things can happen maybe faster, right? The more mental objects need to be created, then it can be slower to learn something, but slowness doesn't matter, right? Success matters. Getting it matters. And so if something's important. So I could make a step-by-step presentation, but it would be a farce, like in the sense of learning, it would be a farce. I don't mean the information would be a farce, but like if you make a textbook and you go step by step and you just start teaching it to someone, the problem can be whenever you're talking about a concept, but the person doesn't have a mental object and a new mental object isn't built for them in a way that works right away, it'll take time for the mental object to come together in their mind. And until that happens, they can't really follow the next step. So again, I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but it's a little helpful to think of learning happening in layers, even if this is not well described. I'm not going to describe it for a long time, but even just like a basic sense of this. And then those layers can get built over a bit of time. It might take a day to create objects, layers, and so forth. So just the fact that I go in steps, your mind might still need time to put objects together. And if, when someone's talking about something and you want to follow it, but it could even be something that is pretty tangible. Like if someone starts saying like my mother's sister did such and such, and they start talking, but if you don't really have a quick mental object for your mother's sister in your mind already, right? We might not have that if it's not someone that's really been referred to much before. So it's actually like abstract. In one sense, it's clearly concrete, right? Your mother, a person you're talking to, their mother's sister, like your wife's mother's sister, right? it's concrete in one sense, but your particular mind might not have a mental object that like comes straight to mind really fast, but they do. And they don't realize quite what's going on. And so they can start talking, but because you don't have that mental object, your mind kind of has a blurry spot there, and it can be hard to follow the rest of what they're saying. Or at least you can start to follow it, and then you're like, wait, who are you talking about again, right? But then if those start to stack, like if they start to bring in other people or other places or whatever that are also kind of blurry in the sense of your mind having a mental object for them, even if they're a place that is concrete like Budapest or something, right? But if your mind doesn't have like much of a mental object for Budapest, then you have, and not much of a mental object for mother sister, then they start to stack and you start to really have trouble following what's going on. And a ton of conversations involve people, just sort of nodding and acting like they're following when they're really not, right? And then our mind can wander and so forth. Inherent to the stuff that we're talking about, often in law of implication, there's new mental objects that we need just to have the foundation or basics for stuff, and certainly in this topic. So just be aware of that. It's not about being smart. It's not about whether the topic is hard or not. It just might take some layers and some time, right, to kind of come together. All right. And it might feel like, oh, if I just went step by step more, but it really isn't. The problem really isn't step by step. It's really about mental objects. And at least I'm very aware of the need for you to have these new mental objects. All right, so I'm not gonna act like you should just already have them, or that the minute I describe a mental object, now bam, it's already concrete in your mind. It might even feel concrete, but it still isn't a temporary type of memory. Your mind has, your brain actually in this case has two types of memory. One that's kind of like electronic, where it has to kind of be fired off constantly, and then another that's more organic, like organic meaning actual neurons built and connections are actually built, which is different than just a pathway firing, right? And that, again, it will take a little bit of time, like around sleeping or so on, something, for it to go into that different type of memory. And you can't like hold a bunch of new mental objects that are having to like just be upheld by electrically your neurons firing, that are all new all at once. It's not so easy. Okay. And there's kind of like the only thing we can do about that is be patient, and I can give you the information, you'll follow a certain amount of it. But it's also, this is good to be aware of when you're talking to somebody else and explaining this stuff to someone else. The more you have that sense of how minds work that way and learn and build with mental objects, and whether or not someone has a mental object, even if you are talking about your mother or sister to somebody, and realizing while that might be kind of a simple concept in one sense, there just might not be like a clear and quick mental picture for a person's mind to just pull up quickly and easily. All right, with all that said, let me give an overview for how things really work, just to give you a sense of like where we're going, all right? Not as any kind of proof or not, but everything helps. Everything creates layers for you. And sometimes kind of knowing how everything will fit together gives you something to grasp, to follow me. Just because I describe this, though, doesn't mean that I've like proven it, right? But again, I'm not trying to prove, I'm trying to help you build an understanding of something that is true and is knowable. This is both, the stuff we're talking about regarding God is both true and knowable in a different sense than just like, oh, can I know that this news report is true? It's knowable more like that we can know 2 + 2 = 5. If you're just careful about the concepts like 2 + 3 = and 5, and you just go over them carefully, you can know that they work together, that equation is true, in a different way than knowing like what a news report is true. And the same can be with other concepts, not just numbers, as long as we're careful and we build them in a way that they can hold still. But for concepts to hold still, we need a basis. And that's the type of thing I'm talking about on these webinars for this topic. All right. So we'll have this slide in mind as I do this overview, and then these mistakes, okay? There's kind of the external world mistake, and there's the internal world mistake. The way around these mistakes and to build properly is to start with your own consciousness screen as the basis for both your ability to know anything about the world and for the basis of goodness or the opposite or absence of goodness, badness, evil, whatever. Okay, so purpose, right, which relates to goodness and so forth, or the lack thereof, and knowledge is the basis for everything else, right? Everything boils down to what appears on your consciousness screen, and then any sort of thought, action, decisions would be to have that consciousness screen be better. And then we could add in the idea that other people exist, also have a consciousness screen, also can be good or less good, right? More or less good. And then we may want, or we could, as we think it through, we definitely, if we're not deceived, we want other people to have a better value of existence, which means more goodness in their consciousness screen overall, you know, over the course of their existence, rather than less, right? Less evil rather than more. So that's what's going on as a basis. We do not directly experience the external world, even if it feels like we do. If a tree or your computer, if it could, or your phone, right? If it could if you experienced it as it was, then if you stop and think about it, you'd kind of always be experiencing it in exactly the same way, always, without it turning off or on. It would kind of always be in your awareness, without changing, right? You obviously experience it through a perspective of some sort, right? Like if you look at it from different angles, or if you close your eyes, then you know, if you close your eyes, the image will go away, right? Our scientific understanding of it being mostly empty space with molecules and atoms and so forth, is different than our experience, like our normal day-to-day physical experience of like your computer or phone. And then there's these anomalies, and this is one again that I pulled on, and I had to pull on it for a while, as if like pulling on a string, to keep getting a better and better sense of what was really going on and how to think straight. Because, as I said last time, if something changes, it can't be the same. And so if I'm saying, well, that's my phone, but if it keeps changing, well, if my perception of it changes, then obviously my perception of my phone, or my direct experience of my phone, can't be my phone, because it's changing. And then, and we can't, these questions or pointing this out can feel a little bit frustrating or disorienting at first, because there's no way to dissolve this or address this inconsistency with people's normal basis of like naive realism, it's called, that you're just experiencing the external world directly. There is no external world that is similar, that's identical or of the same nature as what you experience. So in real life, whatever is out there outside of your consciousness screen regarding your phone, there's no color, right? Scientifically, we have a model that works, right, where color comes from electrons changing orbitals, and then that emits a photon, and depending on the nature of that, there'll be different wavelengths, frequencies, right? And then that'll be perceived differently by chemicals in your retina, if I'm getting it right, but I'm approximately right. It doesn't really matter about the exact details of the science. But there's no color, right, for example. So that's not there, right? So, and we could just go through it. And so it turns out that so this starts to get, again, where people, it's so kind of weird, right, that people just basically just don't think about it, or when they do, they're lacking other building blocks, and there's like this whole cluster. It's like this abyss where everywhere you look, it's confusing and blurry, and you don't have the basis for it. So I had to work through it. And a while ago, I did realize that there had to be something akin to code that the physical world, what the external world that we think of the universe and such, or the parts that we interact with, and both the universe as a whole, plus just my room, my immediate environment, it had to actually be composed of something akin to code rather than like matter would be more like something that was encoded for rather than that existed in the way that we kind of experience it or what our mental object is for. And I can remind you of something I said last time, which is a very profound and a critical part of this puzzle to have the right basic understanding of existence and the universe and perception and so forth, is that in order to grasp and understand and think, mental objects are created for us. But the weird thing about mental objects, or the surprising thing or whatever, is that they're made to stand, to give us something to, they're fabricated. They're a fiction that stands in the gap of like a difference. Kind of like blue is like ultimately a difference in wavelength or frequency than green, right? But we see blue and we see green. We don't see difference, we see a color. Do you see? So blue or green is a stand-in that feels like real and concrete and that we directly experience and so forth. It feels like it's right there in the external world. It feels real, right, in a certain way. And then especially physical objects feel like they can create things. And a ton of people believe that the universe can like do stuff and make stuff, or that the wind or their body that can punch things or move things or write things and do things, right? So even Aristotle had, and they had these things of this type of cause, that type of cause, material cause, whatever. I've learned them and forget them and learn them and forget them, but formal causes and this and that. But we of course need, within our proper understanding of the world, we need to understand how it is. It needs to fit in. Part of our understanding needs to make sense of, well, it does seem like my body, I can do stuff. Can I cause this? Can I write stuff? Can I cause? Yes, you can, but we don't want to have these words like cause that has these multiple contradictory meanings. We want to be able to parse it out and understand what's really going on. Where was I here? Saying the external world. Color. I was saying mental objects. Mental objects are super important, and we can be thankful for them, and we want to learn how to use them right. But what's fascinating about them is that they're fictions. Almost everything you think of as real is a fiction that we use to think about and grasp a difference between two things, or a difference in states between how things could be one way or another. In a certain sense, your dog, if you have a dog, or your computer, or parts of the computer, whatever mental object, right? We can have a computer as a mental object. We can also say that the computer is made of parts, right? And then so mental objects can kind of be chunked up or chunked down, right? Same with the dog. It could be one thing, intelligibly be one thing, and of course it could be lots of parts made up of atoms, or legs, whatever, heart, right? So mental objects can obviously be kind of chunked up or put together, pieced apart. Both are a mental object. Both your dog's leg and a dog they're both mental objects, right? Your car and steering wheel are both objects or mental objects. But in every case, we want to also think about the car's steering wheel, or the car, or your dog, or the dog's heart as actually being the difference between where we might say, okay, now it's a heart, and what wouldn't be a heart, or the absence of a heart. But our mind doesn't work well with just, or the way it works with differences is to create like a positive fiction in the difference that we can feel like is real, like we can grasp. But mental objects can't do stuff. They don't exist. Like blue can't do things, but neither can a heart or whatever. So what's really going on, I said I was going to talk about what's really going on, but I'm drawing a bit of a contrast, by everything I'm saying, to what we think is going on, how things really work, and so forth. What's actually going on is you have this consciousness screen. Again, you want to get used to you want to develop a mental object where your consciousness screen as a whole, and the more it's a daily part of your sense of the world, the better, where everything that you seem to see externally, both visually, feeling wise, and in terms of, like, if you look at a street, even if you like a street that cars go on, right, or a sidewalk that you walk on. So you're walking down a sidewalk, you look at that sidewalk and it continues out in front of you, right? And so I have a experience of the world, just like you, where the sidewalk is solid, and not just the part I'm standing on, right, but the part I'm going to stand on, really the whole part. And I have a sense that it extends past where I can see, right? We'll say the sidewalk goes around the corner and continues on. Like if you're asking for directions, you'd say this about the street also, right? You'd say, yeah, well, this street turns this way and then there's another street and you turn. And there's a sense that it's all real and solid and made of concrete. Of course, I can think that way. I've thought that way all my life, but my also daily normal understanding of the world is just like in a computer game. I could give directions within a computer game for how to get somewhere, right? Like if you're a guy walking around in a city in a computer game and a friend is also playing the game, you could explain, oh, here's how to get to the store that sells grenades, right? Or whatever, or magic weapons, right? You go down this street, you go over there, or you look for this place, whatever. So you can give directions too, and you could talk as if the street actually exists and continues, but it only exists within the computer game, and it actually doesn't appear on anyone's screen if no one's playing the computer game, right? And it doesn't even appear in the active CPU of any computer if no one's playing the game, right? There's the potential code for it. If there's a massively multiplayer game, then there's like a server that's kind of constantly active, that where you have a configuration of how things are configured right now, right? There's a sense of now in like a multiplayer game, right, that other people can play, especially like a massive one, which means it's kind of always around and there's maybe thousands of people participating or whatever. So there's the configuration stored in the server of how everything is configured this minute, this tick. And then there's also code for how the game works, right? That's accessed if you're playing a massively multiplayer game and you walk into an area where you're the only one in it, then of course you access the code for that area that's like static, right? They might update the code, but between updates, it doesn't change. And then there's the sense of how things are configured at this moment. So what you think of or what people normally think of as the real world is very similar. And I didn't discover that by analogy. I don't think by analogy. I'll describe by analogy. I might ask questions by analogy or brainstorm by analogy, but I'm not saying that I know this because that's that way in games, right? The game analogy or metaphor just helps us to better understand what we're talking about. And it's great that games like this, or the computers and games exist, because you have more of a model for what I'm saying than normally people do beforehand, sorry, that might have existed before, right? And there's the idea of the Matrix, right, in the movie series, and it's similar. There's maybe a little bit of interaction between the Matrix and the real world inside the Matrix. Like within the movie, there's like the real world, and then there's inside the Matrix, right? Like a big virtual reality simulation that feels like totally real. With a computer game, there basically isn't any interaction at all. I guess with the movie, there's a little bit where you can maybe die if you died in the Matrix or something. Maybe your brain would kind of kill you or something. Not sure. But in real reality, we're in a certain type of matrix, but there's no real waking up from it. Like if you died and went to like a heavenly type place or whatever, heavenly limbo, whatever kind of place, and that felt like also kind of like a bit of a physical world, even if it was more bright and sunny, whatever, right? But I'm not talking about reality. I'm just saying, like, we're just talking theoretically here. So imagine you were in kind of like a world like might be showed in a movie after someone died. that wouldn't be the real world either. That would, you'd still have in that situation, it would still be the case that you have a consciousness screen, that the world as it seemed would also be like a mental object or a consciousness screen object, that it wasn't there. There is no waking up like in the Matrix to a real world that's actually hard and has color, right? That all exists in our consciousness screen, and just like in a computer world, it exists in a way that's intelligible, and all the hardness and physics and so forth in it. Like if there's a wall that you need to blow up in a computer game, and someone could say, well, see, it's real. Look, if I shoot at the wall, it doesn't break, but if I use explosives, it does. That proves it's real, right? Of course it doesn't prove it's real. That's just the physics within the computer game, or what's coded in there, right? So there is an external world that's akin to like code, that's like made up of like reasons or code. But there is no real world as you experience it in a consciousness screen. There's real consciousness screens. Your conscious experience, your consciousness screen is fully real as a consciousness screen. Just like in a game, what's on the computer screen is fully real in the sense of it really is on the computer screen, so to speak, right? When I use the analogy of a computer game, of course, I run into the problem that the analogy breaks down at some point, in the sense that in a computer game, you can step back to like normal reality. In real reality, there is no normal reality to step back from. But the computer metaphor can still help us start to see things, or begin to have something to grasp. So again, in real reality, there is no realer reality to step back to. You experience the world in your consciousness screen as hard and so forth. And the hardness works. If I follow someone's directions that are accurate, I'll get to where they were telling me, I'll get to where I was trying to get to. If I continue to walk on a sidewalk, it really will act hard. So it works just like a computer game will work, right? Generally speaking. And so our model of the world, our naive realism model works. But it isn't correct in the sense that your phone really is gray or white or whatever, right? There is no sidewalk as I experience it in my consciousness screen, except in my consciousness screen. The nature of what you experience in your conscious screen is only the type of thing that can be experienced by a conscious being in a consciousness screen. The reasons behind why you experience what you experience, and there's a tremendous amount of consistency in the world, such as physical laws and such, right? And there's even more consistency past physical laws. But there's a tremendous amount of consistency. So there's clearly regularities in the reasons, right? In the code for the external world. And I'm not at all denying that, I'm affirming it. Those regularities are real. The code is real as code, but there's nothing like what you experience consciously out there somewhere. Your conscious experience is only the type of thing that can be experienced consciously, and only, just like the stuff on a computer screen, like what you're seeing on a computer screen only exists as something on a computer screen. It doesn't exist inside the computer somewhere, right? Like if you see a tree or a wall or enemies with guns on your computer screen, there's no actual enemies with guns inside the computer or behind the computer or outside somewhere. And real reality is actually exactly like that. Other people are real. Things are real in the sense of consistency and code, but they're not real in the sense of what you experience. It exists outside of experience. The reasons exist outside of experience, and acting as if there's a real world out there that just as we experience it, that's external and we all participate in, that works, except when we run into concepts and limits where it no longer works. And it's critical to have the correct understanding of the way the world really works in order to think about God. And it enables us to think about cause real causes and reasons, which will actually, the funny thing is, so I started to say earlier in this webinar, working on the concept of how to know whether God exists. What I discovered allowed me to figure out how to actually succeed and get wealthy and get other stuff I want, like with people and such, right? I kind of, both tongue in cheek, but there's a real truth to it, talks about you get more, intimacy and whatever, relationships can be better. Last webinar. But when we have the right basis for mind, reality, and cause and reasons, then that touches on our actual power and our like free will in kind of a philosophical, religious type of sense. But power, free will and power, if you think about it, are basically synonyms, right? So whatever your free will is in this whole scheme of God and existence and you and your mind and yourself and your conscious screen and perception and experience of the real world, well, you need all these concepts to figure out what your power is, how that fits in. Because again, it's, right, we're talking about reasons, causes, reality. How do we interact with the world? Well, what do I do? And within the normal concept of the world, that again, it works for walking down the sidewalk. It even works for inventing all kinds of devices and like smartphones and stuff, right? One day, humankind will be so advanced, I bet we'll be able to make long distance calls to each other that work, where they're like clear reception, and stuff. But we're not. Maybe in 100 or 200 years we'll be that advanced. The joke there being that doesn't happen right now, but it's still amazing what does happen, right? And the internet might actually work, right? Where you get on the internet and it keeps working, and it's not like problems with all the time. But anyhow, so it's amazing what can be discovered with the kind of the normal, incorrect way of looking at the world, right? If I just think that the sidewalk exists in the way that I experience it outside of my experience. If I think that hardness exists out there, right? Because something code for the hardness of the sidewalk does exist external to me out there in a shared world that we share, right? So it works, but it doesn't work for understanding what your real power is. It doesn't work for understanding other people's not just power, but where their limits are. You see, we ascribe power to other people to control their minds and therefore blame, and we ascribe a helplessness to ourselves that is the root of all kinds of negative emotions and consequences and decisions, right? When we feel helpless, all kinds of bad responses and decisions are made. Conversely, when we feel too powerful, we can commit to all sorts of things that we shouldn't commit, or we overestimate ourselves, or we're arrogant, right? That leads to all kinds of problems. So there's overconfidence, there's helplessness that leads to all sorts of other negative emotions that can lead to disempowering actions and consequences. And then there's all sorts of ascribing to others, like, well, you should have done that differently. You should have controlled your mind, in essence. We're always telling to other people, right? Like some form, and to kids, right? Some form of, well, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have controlled, you should have controlled your mind better. Where you can have a much better sense of the power that you and other people have, but also the limits. So it turned out that I had breakthroughs that were critically awesome, gave me massive advantages with interacting with other people and my own power through this same set of basics and realizing how things actually worked. So it's of immense practical benefit, plus just knowing that God exists is of immense practical benefit in all sorts of ways, probably especially long term, right? And it's why I talk about, I'm confident, it's also, I feel it's necessary to talk in the realm of politics and morality. The other thing about morality, as I pointed this out in recent series, it's not about me moralizing and telling people how they're bad, right? There can be a little bit of that just to avoid, horrible things. But so much of people's morality is a bunch of BS cultural rules, but that really stick in people's minds and limit them in all sorts of ways, including in making money. It gets mixed in with status even, right? Morality is weirdly related to status. And it just has all kinds of things that get in people's minds and interferes. Oh, there's also a huge bottleneck in people's lives where so much of what drives people is a sense of needing to feel superior. And or in other circumstances with the same person, they might just want to not feel inferior. They might not, that someone criticizes them or whatever, they might feel defensive. Right now, someone could criticize you and be wrong, in which case you would need to figure out how they're wrong. So it's not automatically defensive to investigate and or disagree or whatever, or reason through if someone is criticizing. So you don't have to obviously, I'm not saying one should immediately agree with criticism, but certainly there's a need and a goal that crops up and diverts people nonstop from going after what they in other cases in a moment of clarity, they would say, this is what I want in life, or in this particular task, or in, on a small scale or a large scale. But then they constantly get diverted off into what makes them feel superior or keeps them feeling inferior. People will say, oh, well, I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I voted for such and such a person. Well, I would rather not have like thousands upon thousands of people blown up than be able to so-called look myself in the mirror because I voted for the most perfect ideal person ever, right? If there's a binary choice between two people, then and one can be understood where people are going to be so much better off in reality. There's a real life out there, said people, right? And it really does matter, especially if you live in America, who the American president is, just in reality, right? There might be no such thing as legitimate government. That's true. It's one of the things I explain to people, right? So I might be an extreme libertarian, but there's also a real world out there, right? And so I don't feel like I have a moral duty to vote or not. It's not like I think it's a civic duty or whatever, but in reality, if there's actually tons of people that are going to suffer if one person gets elected rather than another, then I go vote because it matters to me if millions of people or thousands of people are going to suffer terribly based on one person being president or another, the relative difference, even if one or the other isn't perfect, or even if one violates my whatever standards of this or that in various ways. Again, there's a real world with real suffering. And that's also why I don't just vote, but I talk about it. Because there's real people's lives or the devastation of their lives on the line. Whether or not they die, they might still have their lives devastated in all sorts of ways. This is, of course, happening right now. I'm recording this, if anyone watches this in the future, and the Ukraine conflict or war, the invasion is still going on. And I don't know, as we're recording this, how things are going to play out. But there's obviously a lot of suffering. So anyway, there's a lot of benefit. There's all kinds of surprising benefits to getting this right. And I say that because fundamentally the only bottleneck that we have together that you or people you're talking to might have is giving up in understanding this, right? I understand it, and I will explain it enough that you can understand it. And I aim to explain it so thoroughly and continue, right? At some point, ideally, I'll just be kind of doing webinars where I talk to people and there's enough people following that, there's kind of an ongoing dialogue, and, right, maybe we talk about current topics, but in the context of, mainly to understand these things or whatever topics people want to talk about. So I'll keep explaining. I've already explained a ton, and I'll explain many tons more. So really, it only comes down to sticking with it, given that it's been discovered by me. Not that you can know that, but at least I'm saying it. But it's very shockingly practical to get these building blocks right, even if it isn't necessary to invent a cell phone, right? Still, I think that all kinds of discoveries, like I used a random example of like curing cancer or whatever, could happen more efficiently, right, and better. Or just if people could think more clearly, then there was a vaccine immediately, like within a week or so of COVID, there was a vaccine made already, right? The anti-vaxxers in the FDA violently prevented third parties, right, people that weren't them, from getting vaccine from people that could make it, right, like Moderna or whatever. Perfectly fine if someone doesn't want to take the vaccine, perfectly fine. But for me, I wanted one, and I wanted it available widely so that people that were worried about COVID that would not participate in business because of it, which I understand, right? I think it's natural if there's a pandemic we don't understand for people to be more hesitant to go to the movie theater or the grocery store or whatever. Like, it's one of the reasonable things to do, right? That's all I'm saying, is to not get out so much. And it was really affecting the economy, if you don't remember. Prior to any government shutdowns, there were shutdowns happening naturally. And so just the simple idea of having the vaccine when it was available a year early, as something that wasn't violently prevented from people, would have been nice, and that could have been known, that could have been understood, to not violently prevent someone from taking a vaccine. If they wanted it. Okay. So again, as you can see, I treat the main bottleneck as persistence on your part, or I'm giving you. I also recognize that people listening are looking to get ammunition or basically the information, the way to share it with somebody else, right? And really, it all comes down to them feeling motivated and interested enough to stick with it, get past the disorientation and confusion of having to rebuild their basic understanding of existence and their perception of existence and their experience of existence and their idea of goodness. Okay, so let's talk about goodness. Your consciousness screen, which again is everything that you feel like you experience externally, like through your senses, tactilely and then visually, auditorily, etc., taste, smell, the whole kind of your experience of what you feel like is the external world, right? When you look around yourself, there's your consciousness screen. You feel like it's out there. The moon, if you look at the moon and it's whatever, what is it, 94 or something thousand, 100,000, I don't know, kilometers or whatever the heck, that might be wild. I don't remember. It might, in one sense, be true that the moon is however many miles away. But if you see it, then in that sense, the moon is in your consciousness screen. Right now, anything that's in your consciousness screen, you don't have like full knowledge of it. You don't see every molecule of the moon or every angle of the moon or this or that, right? So whatever we say is in your consciousness screen, we also have a sense it's an image of it or just part of it, right? But you want to get used to being able to, again, think in terms of your consciousness screen. You can also think normally, right? Again, it's big, like watching a movie. You can get immersed in a movie, but you also want to be able to get unimmersed in the movie if there's a fire or there's a appointment or whatever reason to be unimmersed in it, right? So you want to be able to kind of step in and out of the normal way of viewing things, kind of like naive realism, and into what I'm describing, the law of implication, understanding of the world, or just the correct understanding of the world. But just to kind of further describe what I mean by a consciousness screen, the moon is in your consciousness screen if you're looking at it. Or if you're thinking about it, then what you're thinking about is in your consciousness screen. The physical whole object, does it fit in your consciousness screen or not? Well, again, you can answer that in either way, right? There is no, it's like, again, you can, whenever you kind of feel confused or wondering about it, you can go to the analogy of a computer game to think about it. Be aware, analogies are not the exact same thing, but it can still help you think about it. And so if there's a moon showing up on your screen in a world in a computer game, right? Let's say you're on the surface of a planet and then you see a moon as well when you look up in the sky in the computer game, right? It's on your screen. Is the whole moon on your computer screen? Well, yes and no, right? You can kind of understand how the answer is yes, how the answer is no. I'm not going to answer, I'm not going to further say it. You can just kind of work it out, right? Oh, it's reasonable to say both yes and no. And then your conscious screen also includes what you think of as your internal world, memories, feelings, thoughts. Okay, so goodness. It could be the case that there's no such thing as any kind of differential value of your experience. There's no such thing as like a sense of goodness or badness within your experience. That's not the case, right? So it could be that way, or it could be how it is now. And I'm saying it could be the other way just so you can kind of see the difference. We don't necessarily have a good mental object for goodness right now because it gets twisted by our mind. It's hard for our mind to create mental objects of things where a critical component of the differential, the true meaning of the mental object involves consciousness. I've described this before like powdered milk, where when you powder milk, you take the the water out of it, and then you have to add it back in, right? So the powdered milk is not milk as it's normally understood. You take the water out, and then you have to add it back in to like drink it. You have to add water to drink it. When it comes to concepts that critically involve consciousness as part of where the distinction is, right? In order, the difference between goodness and not, right? Goodness is kind of a word that is going to have to refer to some kind of positive actual concept. But these concepts, a concept can also be understood as the difference between two things, as that's what the real actual concept is. But it's hard to conceptualize the difference between two things directly, and so that's why we put a positive thing in between the difference, as if that's the thing, right? And then our mind makes kind of a positive out of that, like an object. When the difference between two things, like goodness or not, I don't mean goodness or badness. I mean goodness, the absence of goodness or the existence of goodness for now. The very concept of goodness, as part of the necessary parts of that concept, or the parts of the difference between the two things, is consciousness. It involves the conscious experience of goodness versus the absence of the conscious experience of goodness. Whenever you have a concept that involves goodness, I'm repeating myself a bit, but just because this is like new or abstract or whatever. Basically, it involves consciousness and or it's misunderstood in normal thinking. Whenever consciousness is part of a concept, our mind cannot store it in its full liquid milk capacity. It has to like take the consciousness out to store something. But things like goodness, when you take the consciousness out, you're critically removing, you're removing something critical. So what you're storing is fatally flawed. Our mind, as I've said in the past, twists the idea of goodness into like that which seems to that which the mind calculates will further our goals, or a particular goal that the mind has in the moment, and or whatever kind of goal might be kind of activated or relevant to the mind. Goodness is like, oh, if something, this person's good, but the mind, again, it's furthering our goals. The person is kind of overall just kind of supports us or will help us or is actually helping us towards a goal, and isn't if someone's bad, they're interfering with some goal, right? Or if an event is good or bad, it's if it furthers a goal. If you think that through and work on it, you'll see that it works, or it matches up, I believe. So our mind has a twisted, consciousness removed version of goodness that's fundamentally wrong, or fundamentally, it's a concept, but it's kind of fatally contradictory and so forth, because there's another sense of goodness that we need that's critically important for thinking and life, and everything's based on it, which is the goodness that we experience consciously. But again, we don't really have a good mental object for it. So you have to kind of stop and notice the difference between how it would be if there was no sense of goodness. No sense of goodness or badness would mean that we couldn't even begin to think about whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine is good or bad, or just an individual person suffering greatly, if that's good or bad, or if ourselves, if we're suffering greatly, we have no idea if that's good or bad, right? That would be what it would be like if there was no such thing as goodness or badness. That's obviously completely not the case. There would also be no meaning or reason to do anything, including think anything, because there'd be no differential in value of your conscious experience. There'd be no goodness or badness. So the reason to do anything always actually boils down to, will there be more goodness, and at least in theory. Now, again, it becomes very dangerous in life, this twisting of goodness into that which furthers goals, right? If you're Putin, I've put some kind of thought and research to this, and it doesn't matter if I'm right here. It doesn't matter for the sake of this topic, this webinar, if I'm right. I'll use it as an example though. But it does matter in real life, not just if I'm right, but if people kind of go along, get it. It's not about whether Putin felt threatened by NATO. That's very importantly wrong. It's that Putin has wanted for like his adult life to get Russia back to its historical borders. And all his moves and maneuvers, it's not that they're clever or not, or he's playing three-dimensional chess or not. It's just that they're towards that end, right? That Crimea having that, gave important port to help get, stuff. It's that NATO Ukraine joining NATO would have interfered with it, right? So from Putin's point of view, that which furthers his aim of getting Russia back to its historical borders that include Ukraine and some other, what we think of as other countries, that's good. And things that interfere, like Ukraine joining NATO, that's bad, right? The reason why it would have mattered greatly to recognize this accurately would be the only thing preventing this terrible suffering that's going on right now would have been, in real life, just practically speaking, would be a projection of American power and or other countries' power, but they don't have a lot of power to project or whatever, or will to do it, and neither did America at this point. But any kind of sense of America's weakness, such as the way that Afghanistan was left, and or weakness of resolve, and or telegraphing what we're not going to do, if or not we, but what the U.S. government and such will or won't do, if Putin invades. That in real practical life was going to be what prevented the suffering. So therefore, getting that idea right would have been, pretty darn nice for a whole lot of people. And it's very personal for me because I know through my wife a lot of people that both live in Russia and that live in Ukraine. Okay. I use this example both because it's contemporary and we can see how practically important it is, the difference between actual goodness that resides in your consciousness field, your consciousness screen, which is pure and right and to strive for. If Putin understood that and was going for more goodness in Putin's consciousness screen, then that would have been, very different than furthering goals being perceived as goodness. Now, on a very short-term basis, of course, people get a sense of goodness in their consciousness screen, right? Putin's going to get a sense of goodness in Putin's consciousness screen if the invasion of Ukraine goes well from his perspective, right? So of course that's the case, right? That someone can have twisted goals, right? Someone could be a child, wanted to molest children, and then they molest a child, and they feel a sense of goodness in the moment, right? But what we can realize is that what we're going to want is the goals in our mind, we're going to want to be aligned with what's good for both other people and ourselves, like long-term, and therefore our short-term payoff, like pleasure and dopamine or whatever that we get, is going to be aligned with other people and long-term. You see, so we want that alignment. Of course, when that alignment is off or badly off, right, in the case of Putin and such, or a child molester, then we can, if we have like tunnel vision, we can make a mistake and think, well, doesn't it, or we can say something accurate but misleading, which is, well, doesn't it cause goodness, right? Like someone asked me a long time ago, they said, well, what about a person who's happier being unhappy? It was kind of a funny moment because there were just some friends of a friend over, and they were like, well, what is goodness, like in the context of something? And I was like, well, I can actually explain. And even decades ago, I could explain, or what is happiness, right? But I think they said goodness, and I explained what it was. And then they were impressed, but they also were like, well, what about a person who's happy or being unhappy? Well, I just explained, right? No one, you want to maximize the goodness in your consciousness screen net over your whole existence. And of course, that's going to happen if your goals are aligned with, again, I just explained, right? Of course, you're going to get a short-term payoff with whatever your goals are. But if they're misaligned with what's going to be actually better for your conscious screen long-term and or for other people, they could say, well, why other people? Well, if you need other people to suffer in order for you to get a payoff now, like a feeling of goodness now, then that creates like a zero sum or negative sum game. Remember, we're also spreading ideas to others, right? Practically speaking, right? If there's so do I want to encourage other people to feel the same way about me, that they need to feel good, like for them to feel good, I have to suffer, right? I have to have a worse valued experience in my conscious screen. That doesn't make sense, right? And so there's an abundant sum game if I want other people to have better valued experience, and therefore I do, right? Caring about other people, sacrificing for other people may have a practical limit and balance between your own situation and theirs, right? You can only give give so much money away, so to speak, potentially. Maybe I'm open to being, and happily to, being wrong, maybe if we all just give away all our money, whatever. But one way or the other, what we can know is that it leads to a better sum, including for ourselves. Just even from, like, if we start with saying, okay, I want to have the highest net valued experience, the most goodness, since it exists, right? The opposite of goodness existing would be neutral, like no such thing as any goodness or badness. That's not the case. So there is goodness and badness in our conscious screen. So we want to maximize that for ourselves. And then I don't even usually, and now included, spend that long trying to explain why we would want it to be for other people, because I don't think that the people that are going to be watching this webinar in the first place, maybe if Putin was watching, I would explain in more detail, right? But people that are watching this webinar, I don't think they're going to have a lot of resistance to, like, no, I really want other people to suffer. Like, overall, I want to be a Bond villain, or like, in order for myself to be happy. But if you think it through, you're better off. Of course, other people are better off, but there's a higher sum for yourself if you want other people to be happy, rather than nothing or to suffer. Even neutral, where you just are ambivalent about whether someone else has more goodness or less goodness in their conscious screen, it's not as good as wanting them to have goodness, because if you have a goal for other people that gets actually installed in your mind for real, in your real brain, so to speak, for other people to have more goodness, then that leads to more potential for goodness for yourself. Now, you don't have to, like, stare at someone else suffering, but you can, of course, you can want someone else to be better off, and then put a certain amount of resources that are reasonable towards that. But then you don't have to, like, necessarily just, like, stare at someone else suffering, right? That would be anyway. You can think it all through, but this is the basis for what's going on. Is we have a consciousness screen. It's the basis for our knowing, and the goodness resides in your consciousness screen and other people's, and that's the only place that actual real goodness resides. The twisted version of goodness, as that which is perceived or calculated by our mind to further our goals, to get us closer to goal, that is misleading, by the way, sometimes, because your mind doesn't accurately calculate what's going to further your goals, right? Our mind is missing all sorts of information about the future and the configuration of things. So that can be off, right? And I have a whole teaching, right? In the definitive series, one of the main threads is that we can measure progress more accurately and counterintuitively through understanding. Because normally what our mind does is it creates has a construct of the world, where there's this world out there, and it creates a sort of four-dimensional scenario about our goals, and there's a self and there's a world, and then it wants our goals to get, we want the configuration of the external world plus ourself to get, either ourself gets closer or it becomes closer to us or closer in time, right? Like if you want to build a house or build a website or build a business or someone to do something for you, right? Our mind has this construct of the world, and then there's a person, and then there's yourself, and then it wants what you want, your goal, to like get closer, get manifested, right? Closer in time and space, or either you're moving closer to the goal or the goal is moving closer to you, or that sort of thing, right? In time, right? And getting made, getting built, or getting closer. And so that's the type of thing your mind creates by default. That's very suboptimal, believe it. And or it's suboptimal to have that as your like outer frame, is a better way to put it. You're going to have some mental objects for the external world and yourself and the website you're trying to build. That's fine, but surrounding that should be, or more fundamental to that, should be that you measure progress by understanding, and that means building blocks in context. To summarize it greatly, you can watch other webinars I've done to have much more. Same thing though applies to understanding that God exists. You can fill in important contextual elements, foundational elements, such as how causes work. Everything I'm talking about are elements that you need to have in place. And then as you build those things, as your understanding builds regarding topics that are relevant to our goal, like if our goal is to understand whether or not God exists clearly, then we accomplish it by adding or building understanding regarding things that are relevant to that or potentially relevant to it, until all of a sudden we just reach out and there it is. It just all comes together. Or see, it's not steps so much as, right? See, steps are part of the wrong way of looking at goals. Within the right frame, it can be perfectly useful and fine and correct to look at goals like the normal way that I just called wrong, but not as our outer way of looking at it. Okay, so there could be something you want to accomplish where you can simply write down a bunch of steps and then go do those steps and you get what you want. And if that works, that's fine. But you want to, that should be within the context of understanding as progress, period. You should always be able to very quickly step back to like the paradigm or the frame of understanding as progress, period. And that same method or process of success will apply to our topic in this webinar of understanding God and God's existence and basic nature. So to continue with an overview here, it looks like we might need a third webinar for either some details and some final like discussion and such. Actually, let me go to some discussion here, just because it'd be good. I would say no, Dave. A possible clearer way of looking at that question could be, if something is not currently my conscious screen, is it still in my conscious screen? Let me see here. Oh, okay. So you posed a question and then you continued. Can anything in my CS do anything? Oh, yeah. I'll get to Lawrence's. But Bryn, there's a kind of something I could say quickly that's an important part of my summary that I left out. In essence, God, in one way of understanding it, God does everything. There's still a room for your power and free will. But God creates consciousness screens, period, end of story. But God does the configuration of your consciousness screen is for a reason, right? If you're playing a massively multiplayer game online, the computer processing does everything in one sense. And it does things also for a reason. So the cause within the metaphor, the cause is the computer processing in one sense, right? Again, the metaphor breaks down in the sense because there's ultimately God does everything, right? So no metaphor is going to change that. But taking it as a metaphor, the computer processing does everything in a multiplayer game or in any game. But there's still a configuration on your screen and in the reality of that tick, that moment in the game that everyone's participating in. And that happens for a reason, right? And what's the reason? It's not one simple reason, it's a complex amount of reasons that have to do with the code for the game that's static, unless there's an update, and the individual actions of all the people, right? Like, so, right? So the reason for your consciousness screen to be configured the way it is, God does it fully. But the reason is kind of a mixture of your mind, like your interface with the world, yourself and your mind, plus the external world. You can think of other people's doing stuff and interaction as affecting the external world in one sense. And or you could say it's a mixture of everyone's interfaces, right? Just like in the computer game, plus the kind of static code for the world, physical laws and such, whatever other laws. Physical laws, for example, can't do anything either. Gravity can't get up and do something. Gravity is a regularity by which God does things. You see, so gravity and physical laws don't do anything. The universe as a whole is a mental object. It can't do anything any more than Superman can do anything, or that any more than Gandalf can come and save Ukraine or something, right? Gandalf from like Tolkien, the Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings. So the universe literally can't do anything. I do want to have a webinar where I talk about evolutionary theory separately. But regardless, even if evolutionary theory, which is beyond ridiculous, believe it or not, the evolutionary theory is more of an interest because of the insight into how wrong ideas can be so arrogantly held by people and also seem so right. That's why evolutionary theory is interesting, because it could seem so right to many people, and they're really arrogant and condescending about it. And it's so stupid. It's not even like a little bit right, or like it's so beyond stupid as a theory, and yet it feels so sensible and right. So it's a fascinating case study. And for me, as in practice, it was one of the things that really helped break things open for me, is being able to see that. The wrong lesson from it is like, from evolutionary theory and how wrong it is like, well, don't trust the experts, right? You don't just go against what the experts say either, right? You just it's more complex than that, right? Okay, so can anything in my CS do anything? No. Your consciousness screen doesn't do anything any more than the computer screen does anything in terms of the game, but it's a critical part of everything. You do have free will, but I'll just cut to the chase with it. It's gonna have to be, first of all, binary, believe it or not. You can't, anything that's not just an on or off, basically, which I realize this could be a confusing thing from the get-go for me to talk about this, but it's still, by giving you the final answer, it can still help you work through things. But your free will would have to be binary, because if you had a whole bunch of choices at any moment that weren't just binary, yes or no, on or off, then your real power would have to involve calculating and choosing between a lot of choices. Maybe I'll work on explaining this better in the next webinar. Why it has to be binary. Like I've worked through it before, but it's not coming to memory like how to explain it very coherently now, and I want to get through a few things. But it does have to be binary, which is weird, because we normally think that we have a lot of choices, we can do a whole bunch of things. But whatever your actual power is as a conscious being, so I don't know if I've said this clearly, I think I've referred to it, but we have our consciousness screen, we build the meaning of who we are. So you, whoever you really are, your actual real correct identity, is another one of those concepts where consciousness is critical for that mental, for that reality, that mental object, that thing, that meaning. So your mind can't think about it properly. So your own the normal way of thinking of yourself, your self-identity, which is really important to have right, is critically and fundamentally flawed. Just like goodness is like a really important one to have right. And all the badness in the world is in essence rooted in the twisting of goodness by our minds collectively into that which furthers our goals. It's just horrible. That's the kind of root of all evil in a certain sense. In one sense. There's kind of a number of critical bottlenecks that cause the badness that we see. But that's one of them. You, again, is fundamentally flawed in our mind's conception naturally. So we can just build it right, and it's simple. Once we get conscious screen, you are that which is aware of your conscious screen. And I would say you're a being, but I create the idea of being as just a category of things that can be conscious, right? Like other people and yourself. So you're a being in that case, but the word being doesn't have any external meaning that I'm importing, right? I'm just building the idea. You're a being that is aware. You're an individual being that's aware of your consciousness screen, including you. And then we can build some other understandings that you're the one that experiences goodness or not, and or badness or not. And then if you have free will, which you do, you have some amount of power and free will, which kind of are interrelated concepts, then you're responsible. Like you're actually morally responsible, in a sense. Like it's just logic. I'm not really making a moral statement here. Given that you have your power, your free will could only be something that's related to you having more goodness or not, net, in your existence. There wouldn't be any sense of power that was relevant if it wasn't directly related to you being able to experience more goodness based on you using your power. So it would actually be, once it's binary, once you understand that, and that you understand that your power has to be related to having more goodness, and then including for others, then if you use your power, there'll be more goodness. If you don't, there won't be. That actually has to be how it works. You could say, well, how do I know if I'm using my power? That's a natural question. Well, by understanding, right? The more you seek understanding, and ironically, that does work on itself because your power is about seeking understanding. If you seek understanding about seeking understanding, then that's where you want to go with your power. And then naturally, more understanding about understanding will be accumulated, and that will create a ripple effect leading to the rest that you think you're doing. But basically, your power lies in you're seeking understanding about understanding. If you do that, everything else will be done for you. It'll feel like you're doing it, like your body's doing it. It'll feel like you're coming up with thoughts and so forth. But everything else will be done for you and lead to more goodness if you seek understanding about seeking understanding and seek understanding about that which is good and important. There was an individual YouTube video on thehill.com where they talk about politics in a reasonably balanced, reasonable way. And one of the people, Kim, who's well liked there, who's kind of she was talking about misinformation, and she acknowledged that she's not really in Russian media, and she's sure there's plenty in the Russian media, but she's most of what we're hearing is the non-Russian media, and so she's going to be pointing out misinformation that's kind of pro-Ukraine misinformation, but she still wanted to point it out. And I made a comment that everyone disagreed with, which is, like, she pointed out how, like, on some articles about what was going on in Ukraine, a picture of a woman from 2014 was used outside of a ruined building and things like that. But these nitpicks, I was saying, it's not, what people were missing is that I didn't really explain this in my original post that I did, but what people were missing is, like, people was like, well, truth is so important. Like, it's so important to have the truth. No, important truth is important. Like reading the National Enquirer, even if everything in the National Enquirer was true. I don't know if that still exists these days, but right, even if everything is true, or on Nancy Grace or whatever, if it's all true, if it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, right? Like a picture of of you or anyone could, like sitting on the can, right, the toilet, could be true, but it isn't like we have to put that online and expose it, right? So the reality of what's happening in Ukraine was real and horrible, and they needed help, right? And so pointing out a few nitpicks of this article or that place where they were using kind of fake photographs or photographs that weren't about the actual thing, but they still communicated, or it didn't change the reality of what's going on, right? You see? So that I use that anecdote just to point out that you're seeking understanding about what's true, but about what's important and what's important regarding more good. Now, you don't have to guess right all the time. Like, so as long as is reasonable that something might relate to what's good and important, you can seek understanding about it, right? But just keep that in mind. So we have a lot of new messages. Are these? That new message might be what already was on my screen, but just in case, I'll refresh. Yeah, okay, it was. So the conscious screen is like a movie that's playing plus another reason mixed in, which is our free will. I wouldn't call it a free will reason. A very important thing about conscious screen that's different than a movie potentially is the goodness that's intrinsic within it, right? It's like you can have a virtual reality or a computer screen, right, where you're looking at stuff, but if you had like electroshock or something where you are made to, or direct things to dopamine or pain centers in your brain that were firing off goodness and badness, like particularly, that would be a very different sort of virtual reality experience than if you're just looking around a room, but nothing's being kind of like stimulated directly in your mind to make you feel good or bad. Be careful. I didn't mean there that good or bad is necessarily like is intrinsically related to your brain. There's a realistic thing I said about interface. Part of the reasons why your conscious screen is the way it is yourself, your brain, your mind, other people's as well. But I don't mean to say that there's like a 1-for-1 between your brain and goodness. But realistically, it's part of the reasons, right? So, but you see the difference between like a virtual reality that has that jacked into your brain and firing off pain and pleasure versus not. Very, very different, right? And so your real consciousness screen differs from a computer screen in the sense that you're having this real experience very viscerally of goodness and badness. Yeah, good. And Mike is saying, brilliant. I see things in such a different way now, even after all these years. Excellent, Mike. Love it. Yeah, I'm working on this stuff. Like kind of a lot of it's explaining it, but yeah, it's strange how there's layers to just like it's one cluster of concepts. It doesn't change about what I'm talking about here, but we really want to get them right and get them properly. So let me read what Lauren said. So both our conscious and unconscious forms of thought are based around differences. One thing, another way that I might put it, even I haven't finished reading here, but reality, external, whatever, is based, what's real are differences. Like if I said, is one real, then people might scratch their heads one way or the other. We could kind of make a case either way. But is the difference between 1 and 2, which is basically 1, right? 2 minus 1 is 1. Or let's say between 1 and 3, the difference between 1 and 3 is 2. That's real. That difference is real. Now there's of course we could say, so there's a difference between 1 and 3. Then there's in a computer game or a massively multiplayer game, there's things that are real within the game that really affect the configuration of the game, right? But there's still differences, right? Like the theoretical difference between 1 and 3 in and of itself isn't causing you to feel good or bad or making a dog appear or whatever, or affecting a computer game. But even within a game or what we think of as real life, what's real are differences and mental, but we can't think directly about differences. So there's the mental object that's placed to represent the difference, to create kind of a positive, graspable, picturable thing inside the difference. What's critical for thinking accurately is to keep our mental objects the same, like not change them while we have the same word, right? While it's critical that a mental object doesn't change while acting like it stays the same. So, and this, to go back to our, like the idea of goodness itself, the mental object, the real concept of goodness, the mental object stands for a difference, right? Goodness, real goodness is a differential. That's what's real, the differential in goodness. But and kind of the theoretical differential in goodness is where we have the word goodness to represent the theoretical difference that is goodness. In your experience, there's a differential in goodness that we experience as good. The difference is real. The experience that's tangible is kind of something that we, again, experience that's tangible of the difference. Again, all of this is just consistently building understanding. So there's not necessarily like a magic word I can say here or exact steps I can go in. I just kind of keep infilling understanding, and then we kind of get more. Our conscious being, I'm reading now from Lawrence again, our conscious being, our being conscious allows us to easily see, well, it allows us to see, period, versus have no experience whatsoever, the difference between things. I would say more, it makes it possible for us to experience objects, experiences. When I'm using objects, just like I use bottlenecks in the definitive series in an expansive sense, I'm using objects in an expansive sense here. Anything that you experience or can think about, I'm kind of referring to as an object. An object makes it possible sort of for us to see the difference between things. And so does being conscious. Being conscious in the first place, and then objects in our consciousness, in our consciousness screen, make it possible. Whether it's easy or not is kind of just, a little bit, it's basically yes and no, depending on kind of how we build the definition of easily in this context. But since our minds aren't conscious, yes, excellent. So our mind is part of ourself. Our mind is part of the reason, part of our interface, and then part of the reason why God makes our conscious field the way it is right now, configured the way it is, rather than a bit different, right? If our mind was a bit different, related to this, like, current, what's being accessed right now, what's relevant right now in our mind, right? There might be things in your brain that could be wired differently that wouldn't be relevant or accessed or activated right now, right? But if it's something related to what's going on right now, then if our mind was different, then our conscious screen would be different, right? God would make our conscious screen differently configured in the moment if our mind was different and it related to like the activated or relevant part of our mind. But since our minds are unconscious, they are not capable of grasping those differences. I think regardless of whether you're conscious, you don't really, to grasp a difference, you kind of have to make a positive out of the difference, like a tangible thing, kind of thingify the difference, as far as I can tell. The mental object thing and the clarity I have about it, it's a little bit new to me, which also means there might be edges in places where I'm a little bit not so clear. And because again, first you see something by seeing how it's different than something else. So to understand, I'll say this, to understand something, you want to try to create objects out of both of the sides of the difference and compare. When you try to look directly at an object, that's when it starts to get confusing, weirdly enough. If you try to look at a dog to try to figure out what a dog really is, you start, well, what is it? Is it molecules? Is it not? Is it this? Is it that? So then you have to look at, well, what is it the difference between? And that's when you run into the needing building blocks to even answer that, right? Because that's a new type of question, a new type of way of thinking about it that people don't normally have the tools for, is to think, well, what's the difference between? That's confusing with the normal building blocks people have. So we're trying to build those. And I don't even have necessarily all of them. But first you see a difference, like goodness. Goodness is the difference. Goodness in general is the difference between no such thing as goodness and goodness. Sorry, that's wrong, but like kind of logically wrong. But it's the difference between Goodness is something you experience directly, like blue. So in one sense, blue is itself because it's inherent to your consciousness screen. So something that's inherent to your consciousness screen, it's rooted in a difference, but it's not a difference. Like a mental object, it's a mental object as you experience it. It's based in a difference, but in and of itself, as a mental object, it's not a difference. So the idea of goodness is based in a sense, in understanding it, in seeing trying to see the difference between there being no goodness and then experiencing the possibility of experiencing goodness. But then, like blue, you experience it directly. So to kind of understand it as distinct from your mind twisting it and so forth, you want to try to conceptualize the difference of what if there was no such thing as goodness or badness at all, just all neutral, comparing it to neutral. But then you experience it directly, kind of like blue, and it's a little bit weird that way because it can't be stored in your mind. So you can't think about it in the same way that you can think about things that your mind can store. So you kind of have to orient yourself to goodness, or even your self-identity. Knowing is another thing that needs consciousness. And so to be aware of these things, you kind of have to hold it in your awareness, and it kind of slips through your fingers in a certain sense, and that's okay. That's kind of inevitable. It's kind of the only way it is. But you can know it's there by kind of looking at the opposite. We can kind of know goodness is there, even if it's kind of constantly slipping through our fingers in a certain sense. But you see, this is worthwhile to think about and build and understand. And as I just said, some of these building blocks can only be, and I'm adding something to what I just said now, actually. Some of these building blocks can only be stored in your mind in the sense that it's like kind of like powdered milk plus a note, add the water back in. Like you can only store the concept of goodness in your mind, or you, who you are, or your consciousness screen itself, or anything that involves consciousness. You can only store it as the concept without consciousness with a note to stop and experience it directly. Like add the consciousness back in. But this is necessary. You know, all this is necessary. Dave Mazzaro says all the problems of the world would be solved if everyone would seek understanding eventually, and at least a whole ton of them would be solved. And whatever was left over, then it'd be a lot less, and we could think about that, right? So we don't actually have to prove that all the problems would be solved, right? Maybe God would have to create a different sort of universe, so to speak, to have no problems. But maybe God would do that once we get to a certain point, right? Whatever it is, but certainly we are adding to problems, or these contradictions, like I pointed out with Putin, right? Obviously, that invasion is adding to the badness in the world in an unnecessary way. It's not inherent to the universe that Putin has to invade Ukraine. The possibility that's inherent, right? By the way, the main practical objection to God's existence is the problem of evil, and I'll just quickly give a sentence about that. So we'll do a third webinar on this to kind of address any kind of loose ends and finish things. But the simple but correct answer is that so there's also the idea of love, right? So love, or it's related to caring. We don't have to have we can kind of lump love, caring, and related things into one overall concept, where for now we can parse them out later if we want to, but for now it's this idea of, to some degree, like I may not sacrifice everything just for one other person to be better off, but I'm willing. I first of all, I care to some degree. Especially if everything was neutral, if I don't have to pay anything, I would rather other people have more goodness in their consciousness screen rather than less, and less badness. It's actually the case, is I have to kind of recall my explanation of this, but for the future. But goodness and badness are actually two separate things on their own sliding scales, rather than badness just being the absence of one or whatever. Perhaps potentially, I'll work on that and try to get that even more clear. Or at least want to allow for the potential of that. So not just assume that there's only one thing, goodness, and then there's more or less of it, and that it's bad or evil to have less goodness. So this you might have to replay to kind of get what I said, but or even get more of what I said. But anyway, like kind of the short answer to the existence of evil is correct, but then understanding it more can be necessary for someone that has the objection. But it basically comes down to, well, what my explanation is kind of more than the standard one, but it's related. There's more good overall if God allows for the possibility of abundance, but abundance also allows for the possibility of less is less. So abundance is like more is more, right? So the more I care about other people and love other people, love is a little bit more related to what I would sacrifice of my resources, right? In order for a person to be like better off or have more goodness. So the more that's available for me to care about others' goodness rather than just my own, the more overall goodness, because now they can have more goodness, that'll give me more goodness, you see, and so it kind of increases. That's abundant, that's like more is more. So clearly the universe, so to speak, the world that we're sharing, that we're all interacting together in, even if it's code, we're still interacting for real, right? People's consciousness screens are real. Goodness and badness are real, very real, the most real thing, right? So God obviously created a universe where a shared interaction is what I'm referring to, where there's more is more, but also that means less is less. Like evil leads to more evil, bad leads to more bad. That's why I say justice is not actually a good concept. It's not a concept that leads to goodness. God is not just. And if you read what Jesus said, again, I don't use Jesus as proof. I use it kind of in parallel or after the fact or you know, for various reasons, but not as a proof. But Jesus, you know, gave anecdote or parables where showing that it wasn't about justice. Justice is not one of God's qualities, believe it or not. Justice is like for every bad, we need to double down on it, right? In order to somehow get rid of bad. But the only thing that's really going to get rid of bad ultimately, that's going to win, is bad. It's like darkness, right? It can't stand up to, like, darkness just loses to light. Bad ideas lose not to good ideas. See, I don't fight, or I don't ultimately advocate as a final answer, right? There might be a temporary moment when one needs to fight at the level of someone else, but ultimately I'm not looking to fight. When I want to win, ultimately I'm looking to get underneath the struggle to where I just win, like because of the frame, like with Othello, right? When I refer to it, you get the corners and the outer frame, and then you win by going underneath or greater or more fundamentally foundational, more contextual. You surround the thing. So I don't believe that you fight bad ideas with good ideas. That doesn't work. It works on the level of like struggling. Like it can work to some degree, but it doesn't give you like an automatic inevitable win. It's not overpowering, right? Ideally, if that's going on, you want to devote some of your resources to it's like Stephen Covey with his 4 quadrants. If you look at 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, if you're dealing with stuff that's important and urgent all the time, you're not getting ahead. You still might need to do it, but you want to be dealing with stuff, he points out, that it's important but not urgent, so you kind of get ahead in life, right? Like if you need to struggle financially, fine, but you ideally want to have put some amount of time into getting ahead financially, right? There's more examples of this. So I don't believe in only combating false ideas with true ideas, certainly not with censorship, right? Instead, you combat false or bad ideas, or you dissolve the evil in the world by dissolving the evil ideas, and but you do that not by combating it directly with truth. You combat it with a method of knowing truth, right? Same way, I don't want to show you I don't want you to know that God exists by me giving convincing arguments and proofs. That's arguing at the level of the thing, right? That's struggling. And the trouble with winning a struggle is that later someone can struggle back and you can lose again, right? I want to like fully and utterly obliterate and dissolve the idea that God doesn't exist correctly by having you have the right method to understand foundationally and underneath, right? That's what I saw with the creation evolution debate, was they were kind of fighting on the same level. And so we needed to get underneath that. And then, right, and so in the world, I was talking about goodness, badness, and so forth, and free will, and the problem of evil. And so God made a situation where good led to more good that could maximize good overall. God obviously did not make a situation where the only other thing God could do is make like a state of bliss that God upheld everything, where we didn't have basically free will in the sense of where we could choose or do something that led to goodness or more goodness or less, right? Less is less, more is what if we don't use our free will, things get worse and worse. If we do, overall, not every second, but overall, like good things can happen to someone that's not using their free will, right? But overall, things get worse and worse, they degrade. If we use our free will, they get better and better. It leads to good that leads to more good in a powerful upward spiral. So that's the type of world that God created, rather than a world where we were all like on ecstasy, metaphorically speaking, but we couldn't have any free will in that case. The minute God intervenes, like if God starts curing people of disease arbitrarily, then God just kind of has to do everything. There may be some supernatural laws by which prayer works and such. And I would guess that's likely that prayer, there's some, even that would have to operate though, not arbitrarily by whims of God. It would somehow have to follow certain metaphysical or whatever you want to call them laws, some sort of regularity, because God can't have whims. That's one of the aspects of God. Like we could just kind of have whims, right? Like from our mind, but God can't just do things arbitrarily, basically for no reason. So that's kind of the answer to the problem of evil, is that's what's going on. Okay, great. I will basically end. I kind of have to stop at a bit of an arbitrary stopping point each webinar, but I'm not going to stop the series arbitrarily. So we'll at least do one more webinar and continue with this. And I say this sometimes I don't do it, but I may well refer back to this because I haven't gotten to a lot of the comments and I bet they're pretty good and useful. So this topic in particular, especially since between the definitive series and then the explained series, which is actually a really good follow-up to the definitive series. It's almost why I didn't continue the definitive series, is because I realized that it kind of dovetailed right into the explained series. I just did them kind of maybe the wrong order, perhaps. The definitive series is more to kind of get people into law of implication, a bit of a practical, tangible, more understandable way to start with. And it's more of like from a strategic point of view. And then I still have a lot of topics I want to cover. I really want to cover more about goals. I don't deal with that as a separate topic. There's evolution, there's relationships. I can talk about success. So I'm going to be doing these kind of topic related series. But in each case with the topics, I think it's pretty clear now that what I should do is do as many webinars as it takes to really treat them comprehensively. So I think that's what I'll do. And right now that's God and God's existence. I thought that last week's webinar could probably replace the whole definitive series. That's funny. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, depending on what you mean, if it's an introduction. But yeah, with everything, it's like layers, right? I kind of just need to talk and fill in things and address things and so forth. Again, it's not really about steps. I'm always trying, ideally, like I feel like I'd love to have things step by step, but it just doesn't really exist as far as I can tell. It's more like building blocks and layers. You're great. Thank you, Lawrence, for saying fascinating stuff. Looking forward to the topic of relationships and everything else. Excellent. Me too. I like talking about topics. I like it a lot. It's kind of the definitive series and the explained series were kind of hard in a sense. It's kind of weirdly easier talking about topics. Everything, it all has to be done though. Thank you. And also for those 2 basic errors you showed. My guess is those 2 mistakes are currently prevalent in my mind. I appreciate that, Bryn. Let me refer back to those. Yeah, absolutely. I think that even everything I've talked about previously, there's still some kind of fundamental things that I think I haven't really gotten across well enough, and that this series about God is helping, and the other topic, like we'll just get there basically. You'd think that all the hours I've done with webinars, both on YouTube and the ones before that, I would have covered everything. But between what I'm still working on and just the reality of this, there's still these basic things that haven't been covered. There's even, yeah, those things I'll talk about. It's like, wow, that's pretty major. And yet I haven't talked about that in like hundreds of hours of webinars somehow. How soon will this be up on YouTube? Well, if people are watching this on YouTube, it's already up, but I'll get it right up. I'll get it up today. And I'll really try to make a habit of getting it up this the day of, because there's no reason not to. It has to finish processing on GoToWebinar, and then in about maybe an hour from now, I should be able to start downloading it and uploading it. And then that means I need to be here. So, but I'll look to do it today and ideally fairly soon. And thanks for being on. Thanks for live participation. Looks like every single person that was on from the beginning is still on. It's kind of fun this time. Proof of God by grand unified theorem, everything fundamental. The theorem is defined by having proven 100% theorability. So, single greatest. Dr. Gabriel Oyao's grand almighty grand unified theorem formula is the single greatest discovery to date, and it changed the dynamics for everything when he, in his own words. Okay, I'll look that up. Okay, I'll look that up for sure. I haven't come across someone else that's had this, but if they have, that's awesome. Or maybe it means something's related or whatever, but I'll take a look. Reason to do anything boils down to, will there be more goodness? Right, exactly. And even, it's already the case, right? Any decision people make practically in real life, in normal life, without knowing any of this, is at least going to be towards the twisted idea of goodness, right? To further their goals. Thanks, David. Deep layering this time of still applying that faith as being consistent to what you know is true. Exactly. Yeah, you can't just use faith like a BS magic wand to know something that you don't know and just claim that you do by faith. That's like inherently contradictory and nonsensical. And a bad witness, for other people. Okay, guys, I will see you. I really may well do it in another week. I think with the events in the world, I feel kind of motivated to move forward by talking about this in a nice way. And it's kind of nicer than directly addressing the events, like kind of politically. It should just do something to really move forward with goodness in the world by covering this. So it's kind of a nice answer to that, since I don't know what I can personally do that's immediate for Ukraine right now. Awesome, guys. But I appreciate people that are doing things to immediately help Ukraine. Okay, take care, everyone, and I'll see you. Look out for it potentially being this coming week again.